Her father had called it the wood storage room. That was the name he used every time, not the cellar, not the basement, just the wood storage room said. In the flat, particular way, he said things he did not intend to be questioned. Marta Hollins had been coming to this farmhouse her entire life. 71 years of Sunday dinners and harvest seasons and the long, quiet winters when her father moved through the house without explaining himself to anyone. She had been in this cellar hundreds of times. She had never once seen a piece of firewood stored here. She noticed this for the first time the week after the estate lawyer called. Not because anything had changed, the cellar was exactly as it had always been, the stone walls, the low ceiling, the packed earth floor, except for the poured concrete section in the northeast corner where her father had done some kind of repair work decades ago. She noticed it because she was finally looking at the room without her father in it, and looking at something without the person who named it changes what you see. No wood, no rack, no evidence that wood had ever been stored here. No bark dust, no resin stain on the walls, no worn path between the stairs and a storage area. The concrete section in the corner was smooth and clean, and had been smooth and clean for as long as she could remember. She stood in the cellar on a Tuesday morning in October with her flashlight and her practical nurse's habit of examining what was actually present rather than what she expected to find, and she knocked her shoe against the concrete floor. The sound came back solid and specific in a way that stopped her. Not the density of poured concrete over packed earth. Something underneath. A hollow register contained the particular acoustic quality of a sealed space. She knocked again. The same sound. She had spent 30 years as a nurse, and she knew the difference between the sound of something solid and the sound of something that was solid on the surface and different underneath. She crouched and ran her hand across the concrete, feeling the surface the way she had always felt for the thing beneath the surface. Her fingers found the seam before her eyes did, a line in the concrete, straight and deliberate, running parallel to the north wall at approximately 4 feet from it. She followed it with her fingertips to the right, another line perpendicular running toward the corner. She followed the perimeter. A rectangle approximately 3 feet by 4 cut into the concrete with precision, not a crack, not settling. A seam that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it carefully. She stood and looked at the old wooden cabinet against the north wall. She had looked at that cabinet her entire life. It held tools, her father's tools, organized in the particular silent system of a man who kept everything in its specific place and never explained the system to anyone. It had always been against that wall flush to the stone exactly where it was now. She moved it. It was heavier than she expected, the weight of solid wood and decades of accumulated tools, and she had to work it forward in stages a few inches, reset her grip, a few more inches. But it moved. The legs scraped across the concrete in the way of something that had been moved before the scrape marks, visible in the dust beneath the cabinet feet, when she looked parallel grooves, faint but present, running perpendicular to the wall. The cabinet had been moved before, regularly enough to leave marks. When she had pulled it far enough from the wall, she crouched and looked at what had been behind it. The rectangle was fully visible now, the seam she had traced with her fingers, and at the far edge set into the concrete a hinge. Brass heavy gauge, the kind used for exterior doors rather than interior furniture. Old but intact, the surface darkened with age and the particular oxidation of metal that had been in a closed space for a very long time. She moved the flashlight along the exposed edge of the rectangle, looking for a handle, a latch, anything to grip. She found the inscription first, cut into the concrete at the near edge of the rectangle in small, careful letters, not engraved professionally, not stamped, cut with something narrow and sharp by a hand that was pressing deliberately into resistant material. VT 1967. Marta knelt on the cellar floor and held the flashlight steady on the 2 letters and the year, and did not move for a long moment. 1967. The year the newspaper had run the photograph of Warren Tate with his eyes red and his hands tight around a picture frame, and the caption that had been printed beneath it, and that Marta had read as a child without understanding what she was reading. Devoted husband pleads for wife's return. She had been 14 years old in 1967. She remembered the newspaper. She remembered the way her father had set it face down on the kitchen table, without comment, the only time she had ever seen him handle a newspaper that way. She had not understood at 14 what the gesture meant. She understood now. Vite! Vivian Tate! Marta set the flashlight on the floor beside her and put both hands flat on the concrete rectangle and stayed very still in the cellar of her father's house and breathed. Then she looked for a way to open it. The estate lawyer had used the word straightforward. Marta had written it in her notepad during the call, a habit from 30 years of nursing, recording the exact words people used when they were describing something they wanted to seem simpler than it was. Straightforward. The farmhouse was vacant, the title clear, the property in good condition for its age. A straightforward sale once she had done a basic inventory and cleared whatever personal effects remained. She had driven out on a Wednesday morning in late October, the first time she had been to the property in 20 years. Her mother had managed the visits in the final decades, or had said she managed them, had reported on the farmhouse's condition with the brief efficiency of a woman who did not invite follow-up questions. Marta had not pushed. She had been working, and then her mother had been declining, and then her mother had been gone, and now there was a farmhouse and an estate lawyer and the word straightforward. She parked at the end of the lane and sat in the car for a moment. The house looked as it always had. White clapboard, 2 stories, the porch running across the front elevation, the old maple at the southeast corner that had grown past the roofline in the years since she had last seen it. The fields beyond the house had gone to meadow the barn at the western edge of the property, standing with the patient solidity of a structure that had outlasted its usefulness but had been built too well to fail. She went inside. The front rooms, first parlor, dining room, the kitchen at the back of the house. She had expected the particular quality of long vacancy, the smell of dust and cold air, and absence the surface grime of a house that had not been regularly occupied, the small signs of neglect that accumulated when no one was paying attention. Old houses had a specific feeling when they had been left entirely alone, and she had expected that feeling here. She did not find it. The parlor was dusty, genuinely dusty, the dust of months rather than weeks, but the furniture was covered with sheets that had been folded and placed with care, the corners tucked precisely the kind of covering that required thought about what was being protected and why. The kitchen shelves held a row of old canning jars, empty, arranged by size, with the particular alignment of someone who had straightened them recently and deliberately. Not the alignment of jars that had been sitting undisturbed for years, the alignment of jars that had been touched. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the shelves and felt the first version of the feeling she would not fully name until she was in the cellar. The farmhouse had been lived in a specific and limited way much more recently than she had understood. She walked the ground floor methodically, the nurse's habit of establishing the full picture before drawing conclusions. The pantry off the kitchen, 3 shelves of canned goods, old but not ancient, the labels of a grocery store that had been operating in the nearest town until approximately 15 years ago, arranged in straight rows, labels forward. Someone had organized these. Someone had been here, had touched these shelves, had straightened what was there. Not vandalism, not a stranger passing through. The quality of the organization was too deliberate, too consistent with the quality of the furniture covers and the kitchen alignment. This was someone who knew the house and cared about its condition and had been coming here privately on a schedule she had not known about for reasons she had not been told. Her father had died in 1989. Her mother had claimed to manage the property after that. But her mother had not driven after 1995, and the nearest neighbor was 7 miles away, and the canning jars on the kitchen shelf were from a grocery store that had been operating until approximately 15 years ago. Her father had been dead for 35 years. She went to the cellar. The stairs were the original construction, steep and narrow, the handrail worn smooth at the grip from decades of the same hand in the same position. She descended with the flashlight she had brought from the car, the beam moving across the stone walls and the low ceiling and the concrete floor of the northeast corner. The cellar smelled of cold stone and old wood and something else underneath both of those that she could not immediately name, something dry and specific, the smell of a space that had been visited rather than inhabited. She walked the perimeter slowly. The stone walls were original, the fieldstone construction of a farmhouse foundation from the early 20th century, the pointing maintained in sections but not recently. The floor was packed earth throughout, except for the northeast corner, where a section had been poured in concrete at some point after the original construction, the color slightly different from the surrounding floor, the surface smoother the edges where concrete met earth, showing the clean line of a deliberate pour rather than repair work. Against the north wall, a wooden cabinet. She had seen it here her entire life. Heavy oak deep, the kind of piece built for a specific purpose in a specific location, the surface dark with age. It held tools. She could see the organized rows through the glass-fronted upper section, the same organization she remembered from childhood, the particular silent system of a man who kept everything in its place without explaining why. She looked at the cabinet more carefully than she ever had before. The bottom edge of the cabinet met the concrete floor. She crouched and looked at where the legs sat and saw it. The floor around the front legs was dusty, undisturbed, the dust of long vacancy. But the floor at the back of the cabinet was different. She could see it from this angle, a pattern in the dust, and in the concrete surface itself, a worn arc running from the back left leg in a smooth curve toward the right and then back. The pattern of something heavy being moved repeatedly across the same path, pivoting on a consistent point over many years. The cabinet had been moved regularly, pushed out from the wall and returned to its position, the same motion repeated enough times to wear the floor in a specific pattern. Not once, not occasionally, many times over many years in the same deliberate sequence. She stood and put both hands on the cabinet's sides and pushed. It moved with the particular ease of something accustomed to being moved, the resistance of weight without the resistance of disuse. She worked it forward until she could see behind it the flashlight beam reaching into the exposed space between the cabinet's back and the stone wall. The northeast corner of the concrete section was visible now, and in the concrete running parallel to the wall and then perpendicular, a seam clean and straight and deliberate, the line of something cut rather than cracked, a rectangle, traced into the poured surface with precision. She moved the flashlight along the edge of the rectangle. At the far edge, a hinge, brass heavy-set, flush into the concrete, the surface darkened but intact. She moved the beam along the near edge and found the inscription. Cut into the concrete was something narrow and sharp, not stamped, not engraved by a professional tool, but pressed in by hand, each letter cut individually by someone working deliberately in resistant material. Small letters carefully spaced the work of a person who understood that this needed to be legible for a long time. VT 1967. Marta crouched on the cellar floor and held the flashlight steady on those 5 characters and did not move. 1967. She had been 14 years old. She remembered the newspaper her father had turned face down on the kitchen table without comment or explanation, the only time she had ever seen him handle a newspaper that way. She had been 14, and she had not understood what the gesture meant. She was 71 now, and she understood. Vivian Tate. If you believe that old houses always hold the truths their owners didn't live, to tell subscribe to follow Marta's story all the way to the end. She drove to the county library the following morning. The library was in the nearest town 12 miles from the farm, a modest building that had been expanded twice since the 1960s. The original stone structure visible at the core, with newer additions on either side. Marta had used this library as a child and teenager before nursing school had taken her elsewhere and kept her elsewhere for 30 years. The woman at the reference desk was young enough to be her granddaughter and directed her to the microfilm archive, without asking why she wanted it, which Marta appreciated. She threaded the 1967 reels with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to work with unfamiliar equipment quickly and without fuss. The archive ran chronologically. She found the October 1967 editions and began working forward from the first of the month. She found the article on October 14th. Local woman missing husband appeals for information. The photograph took up the upper half of the column. Warren Tate standing in front of what she recognized as the Tate House on County Road. 7, a man in his late 30s broad-shouldered, his hair combed with the particular care of someone who understood he was being photographed. He was holding a frame photograph of a woman at approximately chest height, the frame gripped in both hands, his knuckles blanched white from the pressure. The woman in the photograph was young and dark-haired and was looking at the camera with the expression of someone who had not expected to be photographed and had not had time to compose her face. Marta looked at Warren Tate's hands on the frame for a long moment. She had seen that grip before. 30 years of nursing had given her an extensive education in the ways people held things, and she knew the difference between the grip of grief and the grip of something else. Grief loosened. Grief made the hands uncertain, the fingers loose and slightly open, the object held as if it might slip. The grip in the photograph was tight, controlled, the knuckles white from sustained pressure, the kind of grip that came from the specific muscle tension of a person managing something internal rather than expressing it. She read the article. No, Warren Tate, 38, was appealing to the public for any information regarding the whereabouts of his wife, Vivian Tate, née Carroll, age 29, a teacher at the county elementary school. Mrs. Tate had not been seen since the evening of October 9th. Her husband had reported her absence the following morning. There was no known reason for her departure. Mr. Tate described her as a devoted wife and a caring teacher who had given no indication of any intention to leave. He was, the article said, devastated by her absence and remained hopeful for her safe return. Marta read it through once. Then she read it again more slowly, the way she had learned to read medical charts, not for the information stated, but for the shape of what was stated, the pattern of what had been included and what had been left out. Warren Tate was quoted 4 times. He was the only person quoted. No colleagues from the elementary school, no neighbors who had known Vivian, no friends, no family members, no one who had worked alongside her or lived near her or had any relationship with her independent of her husband. The article's entire account of Vivian Tate as a person was constructed entirely from Warren Tate's description of her. A devoted wife, a caring teacher, no indication of any intention to leave. Marta had spent 30 years in hospital wards, and she had learned in that time that when a story had only one source, the first question was not whether the source was lying. The first question was why no one else had been asked. Colleagues existed. Neighbors existed. A woman who had been teaching at the county elementary school had students, other teachers, a principal. She had a life that extended beyond her husband's house, and in a newspaper article about her disappearance, none of that life was represented. Not one person from the school had been quoted. She wound forward through the subsequent issues, October 15th, 16th, through the rest of the month. A brief follow-up notice on October 19th. The county sheriff's office had no new information. The investigation was ongoing. Anyone with relevant knowledge was encouraged to contact the department. Warren Tate was mentioned. No one else. November, nothing. December, nothing. She wound through 1968 scanning for any follow-up coverage. The disappearance of a local school teacher, a young woman 29 years old, a member of the community, had generated 1 article and 1 follow-up notice, and then nothing. No resolution notice, no found notice, no update of any kind. As if the story had simply been set down. She went back to the October 14th article and read it a 3rd time, more slowly still. And then she wound back slightly to the community notices column in the same edition. She had almost missed it. The community notices column ran in small type along the right margin of the same page as the Tate article, local announcements meeting, notices, acknowledgments of various community activities. She read through them without expectation. A single item, 4 lines, no headline. Ray Hollins of County Road 12 is recognized this week for a quiet act of charitable assistance rendered to a member of the local community. Mr. Hollins declined to be named in connection with this recognition and asked that no details be published. His neighbors note that this is consistent with his character. Marta read it twice. Ray Hollins. Her father's name in print in the same edition as the Warren Tate article in the same week that Vivian Tate had disappeared. A quiet act of charitable assistance. No details. Her father had declined to be named and had asked that no details be published. She looked at the date of the edition, October 14th, 1967. Vivian Tate had last been seen on October 9th.
5 days.
She sat at the microfilm reader in the county library with the October 14th, 1967 edition on the screen and looked at the two items, Warren Tate's photograph and his white-knuckled grip on his wife's picture, and her father's 4-line notice on the same page, and felt the particular sensation she associated with the moment in a patient's chart when two pieces of information that had seemed unrelated suddenly resolved into the same picture. Her father had done something in the week Vivian Tate disappeared. Something he had declined to be named for, something a neighbor had thought worth recognizing and her father had asked not to detail. The wood storage room, the cabinet that had been moved so many times it had worn an arc into the concrete floor. VT 1967. She printed both items, the article and the community notice, and folded them into her notepad and drove back to the farm. She called a contractor the following morning. Not a local firm. She had learned in the days since finding the inscription that she wanted as little conversation as possible around this project, and local contractors asked questions the way local people did, connecting names and histories with the easy fluency of communities that had known each other for generations. She found a company in the city 40 miles away that did structural work without the social dimension. She told them she needed a concrete section lifted in a farmhouse cellar, possible foundation inspection underneath, and that she wanted it done cleanly and without damage to the surrounding floor. They came on Friday morning, two men professional and incurious with the equipment for the job and the manner of people paid to do specific work and not to speculate about the reasons for it. It took them 40 minutes. The concrete section had been poured in a single piece. She could see this as they worked the edges, the pour continuous, the thickness consistent throughout. It had been set with anchor points at the four corners embedded in the surrounding floor, the kind of attachment designed to hold the section in place against the weight above it, while allowing it to be removed by someone who knew where the anchors were. Her father had known. She had found the anchor release mechanism, 4 recessed bolts countersunk below the surface, accessible only if you knew to look for them along the edges of the seam. The section came up as a unit. The contractors set it against the cellar wall, and one of them looked into the space below and said in a tone of professional neutrality, "There's a room down here." Then he stepped back and gave her the flashlight and waited at a distance in the manner of a person who understood that what happened next was not his business. Marta stood at the edge of the opening and looked down. A staircase, 4 wooden steps narrow the wood solid and sound, and below a room. She descended slowly, 8 feet by 10. That was her first impression, the dimensions of a modest bedroom, low ceiling, the space between the floor and the joists above approximately 7 feet. The walls were plasterboard finished and painted, the paint a pale cream that had held its color in the darkness for 57 years, slightly yellowed at the ceiling line but intact throughout. The floor was covered with carpet velvet pile, deep blue-green, the color still vivid in the beam of her flashlight, protected from light and air for more than half a century, the fibers soft and dense underfoot when she stepped onto it. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. A cot along the right wall, a military-style folding cot, the canvas still intact, the frame solid. A pillow flat with age. A folded blanket at the foot, the wool compressed but present. A small table beside the cot, the kind of side table that came in pairs and was sold individually when the pair was broken up. An oil lamp on the table, the reservoir empty, but the wick still in its holder, the glass chimney intact and clean. And on the table beside the lamp, a carpet bag, dark brown leather, the surface worn at the handle, and the corners in the way of something that had been carried and finally set down. The clasp was brass, tarnished to near black, the mechanism still intact. On the leather of the handle, scratched in with something narrow and sharp. The same quality of marking as the inscription upstairs. The same deliberate pressure of a person working in poor light with whatever was available. Marta set her flashlight on the table and looked at the bag without touching it. She looked at the room instead. She had been in hospital rooms her entire professional life, rooms built for people who needed care rooms designed around the specific requirements of someone who was not well or not safe or not able to be somewhere else. She knew what those rooms felt like. She knew the specific quality of a space organized around limitation and necessity. This room did not feel like that. The carpet, someone had brought carpet down here, had measured the floor and cut the carpet to fit, and laid it in a space that was below ground and would never receive natural light. Not because carpet was necessary, but because a room with carpet was a different kind of room than a room without it. The cream paint on the walls, the same logic. The oil lamp rather than a bare bulb. The folded blanket. None of these were required. All of them had been chosen. Someone had tried to make this room kind. That was the word that came to her, not comfortable, not adequate, but kind. The effort of someone who understood that the person who would live here was not there by choice, and who had wanted to make the absence of choice as bearable as possible. This was not a room built for confinement. This was a room built for protection. She moved the flashlight slowly along the walls, the cream paint, the plasterboard seams, the low ceiling. Along the right wall above the cot, she stopped. The plasterboard there was slightly different from the surrounding surface, slightly rougher, slightly more worked over, as if the surface had been touched repeatedly in the same area. She brought the flashlight close, scratched into the plasterboard above the cot at the height of someone lying down and reaching up or sitting on the edge of the cot and leaning forward, the same narrow instrument, the same deliberate pressure as the marking on the concrete upstairs and the initials on the carpet bag. "I will come back for you." Marta read it once. She sat down on the edge of the cot slowly, the way she had learned to sit in the years since her knees had begun to require consideration. The cot held her weight without complaint, well made, built to last. She looked at the words on the wall. D, one letter, a name initial. The name of someone Vivian Tate had left behind when she came into this room, had left and had promised in the only way available to her, in a room below the earth, with no way to send a message that she intended to return to. The carpet bag on the table, the words on the wall, the carpet soft and blue-green under her feet. She reached for the bag and set it in her lap. She did not open it yet. She sat in the room her father had built and held the bag that Vivian Tate had carried and looked at the words on the wall above the cot where Vivian had slept. And she let the room be what it was. The room of a woman who had come here because there was nowhere else to go and who had left these things behind and who had promised someone named Dee that she was coming back. She opened the carpet bag on the cot, the clasp released with the particular resistance of a mechanism that had not been operated in a very long time, not seized, just stiff, the brass components compressed by decades of disuse. She worked it carefully the way she had always worked with things that resisted, and the clasp opened, and she folded back the leather sides. Inside 3 items. A notebook spiral-bound, the cover blue cardboard, the kind sold in drugstores and 5 and dimes throughout the 1960s. A bundle of papers tied with kitchen twine, the twine dried to brittleness. And beneath both of those, flat against the bottom of the bag, protected by the items above it, a piece of cardboard approximately 8 inches square, stiff and slightly yellowed. She took out the cardboard piece last and turned it over in the flashlight beam. A child's drawing. Crayon on heavy paper, the kind of paper used in elementary school art classes, the surface slightly textured. A house with 4 windows and a door, the proportions, the unscaled proportions of a child's understanding of a house rather than its actual geometry. A tree beside the house, round-topped the trunk, a straight brown line. 2 figures, one tall and one very small, standing in front of the house, both drawn in the simple economy of a child's figure, circle head and line body, and 4 lines for limbs. And at the bottom, in the large, uneven capital, letters of a child who had learned to print, but not yet to write. "Mom?" The crayon had faded the colors present, but slightly washed the red of the house, dimmed to rose the green of the tree, gone to sage. But the black crayon of the letters had held. Mom in a 3-year-old's hand, still legible after 57 years in a leather bag in a sealed room in the dark. Marta set it carefully on the table beside the lamp. She picked up the notebook. The pages were dense with writing Vivian Tate's hand, the same careful teacher's script as the wall inscription, but more relaxed here, the letters smaller and more compressed. The writing of someone filling pages rather than cutting letters into plaster. Dated entries beginning October 10th, 1967, the day after she had last been seen. Marta read from the beginning. The first entries were factual and controlled the tone of a person managing fear through documentation. October 10th arrived after dark. Ray had the room prepared. There is carpet, which I did not expect, a lamp and oil enough for several weeks. I have the bag I packed in August when I first understood that leaving was not a choice, but a question of timing. She had packed in August. Marta stopped on that sentence. August, 2 months before the newspaper article. 2 months before Warren Tate had stood in front of his house with his wife's photograph and his white-knuckled grip. Vivian had been planning her departure since August. She had packed a bag, and she had waited, and she had chosen the night Warren was away, and she had come here. She read on. October 14th, Ray brought me the newspaper. I asked him not to. The photograph of Warren, I know that expression. That is not grief. I have seen that expression directed at me for 4 years, and I know exactly what it means. The newspaper calls him devoted. October 19th, I asked Ray about Delia today. He says she is with Warren's mother for now, which is better than being with Warren. She is asking for me. Ray told her I had to go away for a little while. She accepted this the way children accept things that make no sense completely and temporarily. I don't know which is harder. Marta turned the pages, carefully reading in sequence, letting Vivian's voice accumulate in the small room. October 28th. I have been here 19 days. I count them on the inside back cover. Ray brings food twice a week and news when I ask for it and silence when I need it, which is most of the time. He is not a man who feels quiet, and I am grateful for this. November 6th. Day 27. Warren has told people I had been unstable. This is the word Ray heard at the hardware store. Unstable. It is a useful word for a man whose wife ran away. It explains her departure without requiring him to account for the reason. I taught school for 6 years. My students and colleagues know me, but the newspaper did not quote any of them. Marta set the notebook down for a moment. She had noticed the same thing in the library, the article with only one voice, only one account, only Warren Tate's description of his wife. And now here was Vivian Tate, 27 days into hiding, noticing the same thing from the inside of a sealed room and understanding exactly what it meant. She picked the notebook back up. November 15th, day 47. Ray brought me Delia's drawing today. She drew our house and left a space for me in it. There is a gap between the tall figure and the small figure, a deliberate gap as if she drew it that way on purpose, leaving room. I don't know how to explain to a 3-year-old that I'm coming back when I myself don't know if that's true. Marta stopped. She set the notebook on her knee and looked at the drawing on the table, the house and the tree, and the 2 figures and the gap between them and the word Mom in black crayon at the bottom. The gap between the figures that a 3-year-old had left deliberately, leaving room. She sat in the room for a long moment without reading. Then she continued. December. The entries became shorter, the writing more compressed, the days harder to distinguish from each other. December 9th, day 60. I have started teaching myself to pass time without moving, a useful skill I did not expect to develop. December 23rd. Ray brought a candle for Christmas. We did not speak about it being Christmas, but we both understood. January 4th, 1968. Day 86. I asked Ray today if he thought I would ever be able to go back. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said not while W is looking. I asked him how long W would look. He said he didn't know. She reached the final section of the notebook, late January 1968, the entries growing sparser, and then a gap, and then a final entry. February 3rd, 1968, day 116. Ray says it is time. W has stopped asking questions in town, or has stopped asking them loudly, which is not the same thing, but may be enough. I am leaving tonight. I don't know where I'm going yet. I know I cannot take Delia, not now, not safely, not without a legal process I don't have the money or the standing for. Ray says he will watch over her. I believe him. I will find a way to come back. She closed the notebook. She picked up the bundle of papers, Ray's letters, the twine coming apart as she untied it, the papers inside dry and intact. 14 pages, she counted each one in her father's handwriting, the compressed economical script of a man who wrote only what was necessary. She read through them in sequence, brief updates on Delia's welfare, on Warren's movements on the legal situation, as her father had understood it. Practical information delivered without elaboration. Delia is well. She is asking a fewer questions now. W has retained a lawyer, but the process moves slowly. She reached the final letter. It was shorter than the others, half a page, the handwriting slightly less controlled than the earlier letters, the pressure uneven in the way of someone writing under urgency or distress. W found out you were in town. Someone told him I don't know who. You need to leave tonight. Take the route we discussed. Don't come back to the county, not yet. He has people watching the roads. I will explain things to Delia someday when she's old enough to understand. I will make sure she knows you didn't leave because you wanted to. I will tell her. The letter was not dated. There was no closing. Marta sat with the letter in her hands and looked at the last line. I will explain things to Delia someday. I will tell her. Her father had written that sentence sometime in the late 1960s or the 1970s. She could not know exactly when the letter undated the context, suggesting the years after Vivian had left the county. He had written it as a promise, a thing he intended to do when the time was right, when Delia was old enough, when the situation had settled into something manageable. He had died in 1989. Delia would have been 25 years old in 1989. Old enough. And her father had never told her. The someday had kept moving forward, and the someday had run out, and now there was a woman named Delia Norris who was 60 years old, and who had spent 57 years believing her mother had walked away, and the letter explaining otherwise had been sitting in a leather bag in a sealed room in a cellar for all of those years. Ray said he would tell her someday, but that someday never came. If you were Marta, what would you say to Delia first? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. She had thought the carpet bag was empty. She had taken out the notebook and the bundle of letters and the child's drawing and had set each one on the table or on the cot beside her, and the bag had felt empty when she lifted it, the particular lightness of a container that had given up its contents. She had set it aside and spent an hour with the notebook and the letters and had not looked at it again. It was only when she picked the bag up to fold it closed that she felt the small weight at the bottom. She reached inside and found it in the corner, a small object the size of a coin, wrapped in a piece of paper folded several times into a tight square. She unwrapped it carefully, the paper dry and fragile at the folds, the creases holding but just barely. Inside the paper, half a brooch. Pearl and silver, the mount delicate, the design clearly one half of a matched pair. The edge where the piece had been divided was clean and straight cut, rather than broken, a deliberate separation. A piece of jewelry that had been made as two halves of a whole and had been divided by someone who understood what they were doing. The pearl was cream and intact, the silver slightly tarnished, but the details still clear. She unfolded the paper wrapping. Written on the inside in Vivian's teacher's hand, careful and small, the writing of someone making the most of a limited surface. For Delia, when she's old enough to wear it. Marta held the half brooch in her palm and looked at the writing on the paper and thought about what it meant to divide a piece of jewelry precisely in half and keep one half for the person you were leaving behind, intending to return it whole when the circumstances allowed. She set it on the table beside Delia's drawing. Then she reached back into the bag. The envelope was at the very bottom, lying flat, the bulk of it compressed by the weight of everything that had been packed above it for 57 years. A standard mailing envelope sealed the paper, slightly yellowed but intact. Around it a ribbon blue, the color faded from what had probably been a bright blue to the particular gray blue of aged silk, tied in a bow that had flattened with age but not come undone. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it. Not one letter. Many. She could feel the accumulated layers through the envelope pages, multiple pages folded and stacked, the envelope stretched slightly at the seams from the volume it contained. She worked the ribbon loose carefully and set it aside and held the envelope. The front was addressed in Vivian's hand, not to a street address, just a name. Delia. That was all. A name with no address below it, the envelope of someone who had intended to send something but had not yet known where to send it. She opened the envelope. 57 letters folded individually, each one dated in the upper right corner in Vivian's precise hand. She spread them slightly in her hands, reading the dates on each one, 1967, 1968, 1969, running forward year by year in an unbroken sequence, the paper of each letter slightly different from the ones before and after it. As the decades changed the available stationery, the handwriting consistent throughout, but aging in the barely perceptible way that handwriting aged across a lifetime, 1 letter per year. 35 years of letters from 1967 to 2002, written to a daughter Vivian had not been able to find, kept in an envelope that had never been mailed because she had not known where to send it. Marta took out the first letter, 1967. Written in October, the month of the disappearance, the ink slightly darker than the later letters, as if Vivian had pressed harder in those first weeks. She read it quietly, her lips barely moving, the habit of a reader who sometimes needed to hear words to fully receive them. My darling Delia, I need you to know that I did not leave because I wanted to. I need you to know this even though you are 3 years old and cannot read this, and may never read it because I need to say it somewhere that will hold it. I left because I had to. There is a difference. When you are old enough to understand the difference, I hope someone will explain it to you. If I can't be that person, and I hope I can be that person, I hope someone will. She stopped reading. She set the letter down on the cot beside her and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she took out the last letter, 2002. The paper different from the 1967 letter, lighter, the lined paper of a notepad, rather than the heavier stationery of the earlier decades. The handwriting different, too. Still Vivian's hand, still recognizably the same script, but the letters slightly uneven, the pressure varying across the page, in the way of a hand that had developed some tremor. You would be 38 now. I have written you this letter every year for 35 years, and I have never known where to send it. I asked a lawyer once in 1978 about finding you. He told me that Warren had full legal custody and that I had no standing to make contact without his consent, which he had made clear he would never give. I did not have the money to fight what he was telling me. I don't know if he was right. I have wondered for 35 years if I should have fought harder. You would be 38. I hope you found work you love. I hope someone kind found you when you needed finding. I hope the gap in the drawing, the one you left for me that Ray told me about, I hope it doesn't still feel like a gap. I am 63 years old. I am not well. I don't know how many more of these letters I will write. I love you. I have loved you every day of your life. I need that to be written down somewhere that will hold it even if you never read it. Your mother? The handwriting at the bottom was more tremulous than the rest of the letter. The signature of a woman in poor health at the end of a letter she may have known was one of the last she would write. Marta sat on the cot in the room her father had built and held Vivian Tate's last letter to her daughter and understood completely and finally what the room had been holding for 57 years. Not a secret. A story that had never been delivered. She reached for the notebook, the 1967 diary which she had set aside when she began reading the letters. She opened it to the back where Vivian had written her dated entries and turned to the final pages. The last entry was on February 3, 1968, as she had read. But below the entry in the bottom corner of the final page, written in smaller letters, the writing of someone noting something quickly and practically. An address, a street, and a town 2 states away. Vivian's forwarding information written in case someone needed to find her. The corner of the page had been torn away. Not by age, not by handling, the tear was clean at the top and ragged at the side, the kind of tear made by someone gripping the corner from the outside and pulling deliberately. The address was gone. Whatever Vivian had written there, the street, the town, the information that would have allowed someone to find her after she left had been removed. The tear was from the outside. The hand that had made it had approached from the cover side, gripping the page from the front, pulling back and down. Not Vivian's hand. Vivian had written the address, had not torn it out. Someone else had come into this room after Vivian left, had opened the notebook to the final page, and had removed the address before sealing the room again. Marta looked at the torn corner for a long time. She thought about the 14 letters from her father. She thought about the final letter, undated, urgent, the handwriting less controlled than his usual script. W found out you were in town. You need to leave tonight. Her father had known Vivian was leaving. He had told her to go. And sometime after she left, he had come back into this room and opened the notebook and torn out the page with her address. She did not know why. She did not know what he had been protecting or preventing or managing in that moment, or whether he had believed he was doing something necessary or simply something he could not undo once he had done it. She did not know if he had understood in the years that followed what the torn corner had cost. What she knew was that Vivian had spent 35 years writing letters to a daughter she could not find because she did not know where Delia was, and Delia did not know where she was, and the address that might have connected them had been removed from a notebook in a sealed room, and the room had been locked, and the concrete had been poured over it, and her father had moved the cabinet back into place and had come back regularly for the rest of his life, checking that the room was still there, keeping the promise he had not kept. She found Delia Norris through the county property records. It took the better part of a morning public records searches, the kind of methodical cross-referencing she had learned in 30 years of nursing when she needed to locate a patient's family member, and the family member had not left clear contact information. Delia had been born in 1964, which gave her a starting point. She worked forward from there, school enrollment records, marriage records, the divorce. Filing she found in the county court records under Delia's married name, and then the property tax records for the current address, a small house in a town 3 hours east, the kind of town that appeared on state maps as a dot, and in person as a main street and a post office and a diner. Delia Norris, age 60, retired, living alone. Marta sat with the address written in her notepad and looked at it for a long time. She had delivered difficult news before. 30 years of nursing had given her more experience with that particular task than most people accumulated in a lifetime. The news that came in the middle of the night, the news that changed the shape of a family in the time it took to say 3 sentences, the news that people spent the rest of their lives organizing themselves around. She knew how to deliver it. She knew the importance of being present for the moment after it landed, of not rushing the silence, of understanding that the person receiving the information needed time before they needed anything else. She did not know how to deliver this news by telephone. She tried anyway. Delia answered on the 4th ring, her voice the voice of someone who had been doing something else and had picked up without checking the number, slightly distracted, slightly cautious, the voice of a person who had learned to be careful about unknown callers. Marta introduced herself and said she had information about Delia's mother. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of a bad connection, the specific quiet of someone who had received a word they had not heard used in relation to themselves for a very long time and was deciding how to respond to it. "My mother left when I was 3, Delia said. Her voice had changed flatter, the distracted quality gone replaced by something careful and controlled. "I don't know what information you could have." "I know," Marta said. "I understand why you might not want to have this conversation, but I need to tell you that what you were told about why she left, I don't think that's the whole story. I have things that belong to you, physical things she kept for you. I would very much like to bring them to you in person." The line went quiet again. "I'm going to hang up now," Delia said. "I know," Marta said. "If you change your mind, here is my number." She read it out slowly twice, and then she sat in the farmhouse kitchen and looked at the address in her notepad and understood that the telephone had not been the right instrument for this. Some things required presence. Some things required the weight of a physical object placed on a table between 2 people, which communicated what words could not. She drove 3 hours east the following morning. Delia's house was a small Cape Cod on a residential street, modest, well-maintained, the garden in the late-season state of a person who had tended it through the summer and was allowing it to settle into autumn. A light was on in the kitchen window. Marta sat in the car for a moment, the carpet bag on the passenger seat, and then she got out and walked to the door and knocked. Delia opened it. She was 60 years old. Marta had known this from the records, but knowing a number and seeing a face were different things. A woman of 60 who had lived alone and retired and carried something for 57 years looked a specific way, and Delia looked that way, not old, not broken, but tired in a particular settled manner, the tiredness of someone who had made their peace with a weight rather than set it down. She looked at Marta and then at the carpet bag. She stepped back from the door without speaking and let Marta come inside. The kitchen was the room they ended up in, the natural room, the room where serious conversations happened in modest houses. A table, 4 chairs, a window, looking out at the side garden, the late October light coming through at a flat angle. Delia sat at the table and Marta sat across from her and set the carpet bag between them. She took out the half brooch first. She set it on the table in its folded paper wrapper, the pearl visible where the paper had been opened, and she did not say anything. Delia looked at it. She reached out and picked it up slowly, the way you picked up something you were not yet sure was what you thought it was. She turned it in her fingers, the pearl catching the kitchen light, the silver mount dark with age. Her hands were steady, and then they weren't a fine tremor barely visible, the kind of tremor that came not from age, but from the specific physiological response of someone receiving something their nervous system had not prepared for. "She had a pair of these," Delia said. Her voice was very quiet. "I remember she wore them to church." She set the brooch on the table in front of her and looked at it. Marta waited. "I spent my whole life thinking she chose to leave me," Delia said. Not to Marta, to the brooch, or to the table, or to the 57 years that were present in the room with them, in the way that long periods of time became present when something finally broke them open. That she just decided? That she woke up one day and decided I wasn't worth staying for? She looked up. Marta reached into the carpet bag and took out the envelope. She set it on the table. The faded blue ribbon. Delia's name on the front in her mother's handwriting. The envelope stretched slightly at the seams from 57 years of accumulated letters that had never been sent because the person who wrote them had not known where to send them. Delia looked at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. "What is this?" "Your mother wrote you a letter every year for 35 years, Marta said. "She never knew your address. She kept them." The kitchen was very quiet. Delia reached out and touched the envelope with one finger, not picking it up, just touching it the way you touch something you were not yet ready to fully receive. Then she untied the ribbon carefully and opened the envelope and took out the first letter. She read the first paragraph. "My darling Delia, I need you to know that I did not leave because I wanted to. I need you to know this even though you are 3 years old and cannot read this and may never read it because I need to say it somewhere that will hold it." Delia set the letter down on the table. She turned and looked out the kitchen window at the side garden, the autumn light on the grass, the last of the season's color in the bed along the fence. She looked at it for a long time. Marta did not speak. She had learned in 30 years of nursing that some silences were not empty. Some silences were full of the work a person was doing inside themselves, the work of receiving something that required the entire self to receive, that could not be hurried or assisted or accompanied. You sat with them. You stayed present. You did not fill the silence with your own voice. She sat with Delia in the kitchen and let the silence be what it needed to be. Vivian wrote 57 letters for her daughter in 35 years, and not one was ever sent. If this moment moved you, helps this story reach someone who needs to hear it. Delia drove out the following Saturday. She had called the night before. A brief call, the conversation spare the tone of someone who had made a decision and was confirming the logistics rather than discussing the decision itself. She would come in the morning. She would come alone. Marta said she would be there. Delia arrived at 9 o'clock, parking at the end of the lane where Marta had parked on her first visit. She got out of the car and stood for a moment looking at the farmhouse, the white clapboard, the old maple, the porch running across the front. Marta watched from the kitchen window and did not go out. Some arrivals needed to happen at the person's own pace. Delia came inside, and they had coffee at the kitchen table without talking very much. The letters were with Delia. Marta had left them in her care, all 57 of them, which was where they belonged. The half brooch was with her, too, in the pocket of her coat, which Marta could see from the slight weight of the fabric when Delia moved. She did not ask about them. Some things were being processed in the private way that serious things required processing, and the processing did not need an audience. After the coffee, Marta took her to the cellar. She led her through the kitchen and through the door, and down the steep, narrow stairs, the same stairs she had descended herself on that first Tuesday in October. The cellar was as it had been, the stone walls, the low ceiling, the concrete floor, with the northeast section lifted and leaned against the wall where the contractors had placed it. The cabinet was pushed to the side. The opening was visible, the 4 wooden steps descending into the room below. Delia stood at the edge of the opening and looked down. Marta moved to stand at the base of the cellar stairs far enough back to give Delia the space of the room close enough to be present if presence was needed. "I'll be right here," she said. Delia descended alone. Marta stood at the top of the lower staircase and listened. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs, 4 steps slow and careful. The sound of someone moving on carpet, the soft compression of old velvet pile underfoot. A long silence. She did not go down. She had understood from the moment Delia had called the night before that this visit was not for her. She had found the room, had read the diary, had traced the letters and driven 3 hours, and sat across a kitchen table and delivered what needed to be delivered. Her part of the work was done. What remained was between Delia and the room, between a 60-year-old woman and the space her mother had lived in for 4 months in 1967, the space where her mother had kept her drawing and scratched her name into the plaster and made a promise she had not been able to keep. Marta stood at the top of the stairs and listened to the silence below. It was a particular silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the specific quality of quiet that belonged to a person doing something that required their entire self. She had sat with enough patience in enough difficult moments to know the difference between a silence that needed to be filled and a silence that needed to be protected. She protected it. Below, she heard the soft sound of Delia moving across the room, a pause longer than the others. Marta understood from the duration and the quality of the pause that Delia had found the wall inscription. She did not need to see it to know. The pause had the weight of someone reading something they had not prepared to read, something that arrived before the defenses were in place. "I will come back for you." Another silence, longer. Then the faint sound of fingers against plaster, the sound of someone tracing letters, pressing fingertips into the cuts in the wall. The way you pressed your fingers into something you needed to verify was real. Marta had done the same thing herself on that first morning, running her fingertips along the seam in the concrete before her eyes had fully confirmed what she was feeling. Some things needed to be confirmed by touch. The silence continued for a long time, then a different sound, softer, lower. The sound of someone lowering themselves to the floor. Marta understood the carpet. Delia was on her knees, or sitting her hands in the velvet pile of the carpet that Vivian's protector had brought into this underground room in 1967 because he had understood that a room where someone had to live needed to be made as kind as possible. The blue-green carpet that had been protected from light for 57 years, the color still deep and vivid, the fibers still soft. Marta stood at the top of the stairs and did not move. Another long silence, and then a sound she almost didn't hear, the rustle of paper, the careful handling of something fragile. She understood the drawing, the child's drawing that had been in the carpet bag that she had left on the small table before she had sealed the bag and carried it upstairs. Delia had found it. The drawing that Delia had made at 3 years old, the house and the tree and the 2 figures and the deliberate gap between them and the word Mom in black crayon at the bottom. The drawing that had traveled with Vivian Tate from the farmhouse into this room and had stayed in a leather bag in the dark for 57 years because Vivian had carried it and kept it and had not left it behind, even when she left everything else. Marta stood at the top of the stairs and listened to her own breathing and the old sound of the farmhouse settling around her and the silence from below. She did not know what Delia was feeling. She did not try to know. She had learned across 30 years of sitting with people in the hardest moments of their lives that the feeling belonged to the person feeling it, and the most generous thing you could offer was the space to feel it without being observed. She stood at the top of the stairs. She waited. They did not discuss whether to keep the room. The decision arrived the way certain decisions arrived, not through deliberation, but through a shared understanding that presented itself as fact. They were standing in the cellar on the afternoon of Delia's visit, after Delia had come back up the stairs, and they had stood together at the opening for a long moment, and neither of them had said anything about sealing it again or filling it in or doing anything to change what it was. The room would stay. Marta understood her part in what came next. She was the keeper. Now the farmhouse was hers. The room was beneath it. And the room needed someone who understood what it was and what it held, and who would not reduce it to something simpler than it was. She was 71 years old, and she had spent 30 years as a nurse, and she knew the difference between the things that should be changed and the things that should be witnessed. The room was for witnessing. They left it as it was, the cot, the table, the lamp, the carpet, the inscription on the wall. She drove back to the city 2 days later with the carpet bag in the back seat, empty now, except for the items she was returning to their proper places. The letters went with Delia. The drawing went with Delia. The notebook after Marta had made careful copies of every page went with Delia. These things had been waiting for Delia for 57 years, and the waiting was over, and they belonged to her. What remained of the question of Warren Tate's half of the brooch took 3 weeks to resolve. Delia had known from the moment Marta placed the half brooch on her kitchen table that the other half existed somewhere. A matched pair deliberately divided the clean, straight cut of a separation made by someone who understood that keeping one half meant the pair could never be complete. She had not said this to Marta immediately. She had said it later on the phone in the matter-of-fact tone she used when she was stating something she had thought through carefully. He kept the other half, she said. I don't know why, so I couldn't have it probably. They found it in the county storage facility where Warren Tate's unclaimed personal effects had been held since his death in 1981. A cardboard box labeled with his name and a case number stored on a shelf in a climate-controlled warehouse alongside hundreds of other unclaimed boxes. Inside the ordinary accumulation of a man's life, papers, small objects, things that had seemed worth keeping and had then been kept by no one. And in a small envelope at the bottom, paper clipped to nothing the other half of the brooch. Pearl and silver, the twin of the piece that had spent 57 years in a leather bag in a sealed room. The mount slightly different in its tarnished pattern from the piece Vivian had kept stored, differently, handled differently, the surface telling the story of 2 different lives in the way that surfaces always told stories if you knew how to read them. Delia held both halves on her palm and looked at them for a long time. She did not rejoin them. She had thought about it, had considered having a jeweler repair the piece, make it whole, close the cut that Warren had made when he divided it. But she had decided against it in the same quiet way she had decided most things in the weeks since Marta had come to her door. The separation was part of the history. Making the piece whole would be a different kind of falsification, a tidying of something that had not been tidy, a repair that would make the object say something other than what it knew. She placed both halves in a small glass-fronted box, the kind used for displaying objects too fragile or too significant for ordinary handling, and set it on the shelf in her sitting room where the light came through the window in the afternoon. Not joined. Side by side, the cut edges facing each other across a 1/4 inch of space, the pearl of each half catching the same light from the same angle. Almost whole, not whole. The letters she framed. Not all 57, she had read them over the course of several weeks, 1 or 2 at a time, in the way she had decided to receive them at the pace her own capacity for receiving allowed. But the first letter and the last, the 1967 letter written when Delia was 3 years old and could not read it, and the 2002 letter written when Vivian's hand was trembling, and she did not know how many more she would write these. She had framed together side by side, in a double frame on the wall above the glass box. My darling Delia, I need you to know that I did not leave because I wanted to. You would be 38 now. I hope someone kind found you. The drawing was in the hallway, the child's drawing with the house and the tree and the 2 figures and the deliberate gap, and the word Mom in black crayon framed carefully the colors still present after 57 years in a leather bag in the dark. Delia had spent a long time deciding where to put it, and had settled on the hallway where she would pass it every time she came in and every time she went out, which she understood was exactly the right frequency for something that needed to be seen regularly rather than occasionally. Marta drove out to the farmhouse twice more before the winter settled in. The room was as she had left it, the inscription on the wall, the carpet soft and blue-green underfoot, the smell of cedar and old air, and the particular quality of a sealed space that had held something for a very long time. She stood in the room on her second visit and looked at the inscription for a long time. "D.I. will come back for you." Vivian had not come back. She had died in 2003, 1 year after writing the final letter in the blue-ribboned envelope, 1 year after writing, "You would be 38 now." She had spent 35 years not knowing where Delia was and not being findable by Delia, the torn corner of the notebook page, ensuring that the distance between them could not be crossed from either direction. Marta thought about her father. Ray Hollins had built this room in 3 weeks in the autumn of 1967 and had brought carpet into it because he understood that a person living in it needed the room to be kind. He had brought food twice a week and news when Vivian asked for it and silence when she needed it. He had sent her away when Warren found out she was in the county. He had told her he would explain things to Delia someday. He had not explained. He had carried the room and its contents for the remaining 22 years of his life, coming back regularly, moving the cabinet, checking that everything was as he had left it, and then replacing the cabinet and going home and saying nothing to anyone. He had not destroyed the room. This was the thing Marta returned to, standing in the cellar on a November afternoon, with the winter light coming through the small window near the ceiling. He had not filled it in. He had not poured concrete over the opening and made the room permanently inaccessible. He had preserved it, had maintained the access, had kept the cabinet movable, had come back regularly for more than 2 decades to ensure that what was inside remained intact, as if he had known that someday someone would need to see it. As if he had understood in the way that people sometimes understood things they could not articulate, that the room's contents were not his to destroy, that they belonged to the future rather than to him, to a reckoning that had not yet arrived. Ray Hollins never told anyone about the room he built. He took that with him when he died. But he didn't destroy it. He didn't pour more concrete. He kept everything exactly as it was, as if he knew that one day someone would come asking, and that person would need to see everything exactly as it had been. The room held the truth for 57 years. The truth finally found the person who needed to hear it. The next story is waiting for you in the playlist right here.